Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us on the show and for giving us this opportunity to interview you regarding Anchorhead. Can you quickly introduce yourself to our listeners? Where are you located? What are you doing these days?
Certainly. I am living in Washington, D.C. I have a family, a wife, and a couple kids, and I work doing technical work in XML for publishing companies. Not very exciting work.
Someone has to do it.
Exactly. And in my spare time, I like to code games occasionally. And I coded Anchorhead 20 years ago. And then 2 years ago, I brushed it off and worked on it some more. And now here we are.
You are famous in the interactive fiction community for writing a game called Anchorhead that Gunnar and I played over a course of a couple of weeks. And there is not a single top 10 list in the internet of the best interactive fiction games which doesn't feature Anchorhead. So it left quite an impression. It also left quite an impression on us. And we're very curious to learn more about the origins of the game and your experience creating it. Can you take us back in time to the time and place when you started working on Anchorhead?
I was living in Austin, Texas. I had gone to school there. I had just gotten married and was working at another desk job doing more technical work. And I was always a big fan of text adventure games. When I was a kid, I'm old enough to have bought the box sets, Infocom and Zork and Trinity and so forth. And when I discovered the Inform community with Graham Nelson and the group of programmers who work with that, there's also obviously TADS and Hugo, and there were a number of other systems out there as well. But Inform happened to be the one that I found the first, and was delighted at the idea of building my own. I like to dabble in programming, and I had dabbled in trying to create a text adventure in BASIC, didn't get very far. So I started working my way through the documentation and building the sample games and learning how it worked. And then I had this idea that I wanted to try something big and submit it, since that seemed to be the cool thing to do in the community I had just discovered. Back then, it was all on it was all on the Rec Arts in Fiction message board and the Rec Games in Fiction message board. You didn't have the nice web-based bulletin boards interface that we have today. And so I just started building it. I had this idea. I've always been a big Lovecraft nerd as well. There were a couple of games out there that explored that genre. There was an Infocom game that explored that genre, but I wasn't really satisfied with any of them. I thought the Infocom game was too kitschy. It was too ironic. It didn't really delve into it seriously. It was very jokey. It was a good game, but it was very jokey.
That was the Lurking Horror, the Infocom game.
The Lurking Horror, exactly. And there wasn't much in the way of fan work by the interactive fiction community in that genre either, which kind of struck me as odd. It seemed like it was good material to delve into. So I just started building it. I had a sort of very rough idea of where I wanted to go, and then I sort of just built it room by room, and it grew, and I was as surprised as anyone with how well it was received.
What year was that when you started working on Anchorhead?
I started working on it in, I think, 96, and I published it in 97.
And how old were you back then?
I was 24.
Was interactive fiction one of your favorite genres?
It was. I always really enjoyed it when I was young and the Infocom games had first come out, and the idea of typing in what you wanted to do in more or less English sentences without the boundaries of, a normal interface where your options are all clearly limited and laid out. The illusion of that I got really swept up in, and it really fired up my imagination. And I always enjoyed them. I've played the whole Infocom genre, and I enjoy reading. And so the text-based interface just really grabbed my imagination back then.
So just to make sure that I understood this correctly, you were already working at that point?
Yes.
So you were creating Anchorhead in your spare time, basically?
More or less spare time. I probably spent a lot of work time on it as well.
But you were also freshly married at that point. So how did that work out?
It worked out really well, actually. Raimi has always been supportive and excited by that hobby. The original character in Anchorhead, to the extent that she is defined in any way, is roughly based on my wife. The tidbits that reveal some of her interests and her features are largely based on my wife.
We were wondering why you decided to use a female protagonist. Was it simply to have your wife in the game?
I think so. I thought it was just kind of cool I thought it would be a sweet gesture to create a character based on my wife and then put her through this hellscape. And also it seemed a little bit different. I kind of wanted to stand out. The trend at the time was to create a sort of blank slate character without much in the way of personality or drives in the game. I think the idea was to have the player completely immerse themselves. It was pretty rare to have a specific character with any sort of character traits or personality traits that were sort of imposed on the player. But I thought it would be neat to have a woman. They're also very underrepresented in Lovecraft's fiction as well. So I just wanted to kind of stand out. And I think in the story, they're just married. The character is just married and has just moved to a new place. And I guess I probably identified with that a lot, being just married myself. And we hadn't moved to the East Coast yet, but we knew we were going to soon. So that was probably weighing on my mind a lot.
So I guess that if the female protagonist is modeled after your wife, then it's probably not an accident that her husband in the game is called Michael.
Certainly. It helped me write. And that, I think, just helped me write the dialogue. It was easy to envision myself getting angry and slowly going crazy. And I could imagine what I might be going through.
So Michael is modeled after yourself?
A little bit. I'm not quite as murderous and horrible.
That's good to hear.
In my defense, the murderous and horrible aspect is another character taking over his personality, of course. The initial scenes where you meet Michael, where he's distracted, hapless, and a little bit infuriating, are probably closer to my real personality.
So if we have all of these references in your game to your personal life, the characters in the game are also moving to the East Coast from Texas. I guess that would also be another parallel. Then is June 28th your real wedding day as well?
It is indeed.
If you go to this length to create a unique female character and even base it on a real person, why didn't you give her a name? Was this like a compromise with the blank slate approach?
It was. I still wanted to have a largely blank slate to let the player insert themselves and feel like they were the ones making these decisions and agonizing over these choices to as much extent as possible. So the personalization, the characterization were meant to be more just little light touches. And I wanted to leave a lot of room to let the player immerse themselves. There's also, she has no name. There's no mention of what she looks like. You only know that she's short, which is also based on my wife.
One observation regarding the female protagonist that I at least made when we played the game is that her femininity is really only defined in relationship to her husband. So she is the wife, and other than that, her gender is pretty irrelevant in the game, I would say, because she's not doing particularly feminine things. On the contrary, one of the first things which she does is break into a locked office and crawl through the mud to the littered beach and things like that.
I didn't want her to be squeamish. I like to think that if my wife needed to save me from a cult, that she would crawl through whatever muck was necessary. And I don't see that as stereotypically feminine or anything else. I wanted her to be the protagonist of the game and for it to drive off of her active choices. That's another reason why Michael is so indecisive and hapless at the very beginning and won't even get up from his desk to help you. He's not an effective character. He doesn't make things happen. He gets acted upon.
No, he's not helpful. We also had our problems with him. So you already mentioned that you were using Inform to create Anchorhead.
Yes.
Can you explain a little more what Inform is and how one creates a game with it?
Wow. Okay. It's a programming language. It was developed by Graham Nelson in, the mid-90s, I guess. I came in a few years after it really got started, I think. So I'm probably not the best historian about that. But it started out as an object-based language. I'm also not the most professional programmer in the world, so I can't talk too technically about it. But it appealed to me because its syntax, even at the time in 1996, it was very sort of natural seeming syntax. It used a lot of plain English words and didn't require a lot of elaborate structures of nested brackets and so on and so forth. It could. There were certainly shorthands that you could use, and it could look as confusing as any C++ or anything else that you took a look at. But in comparison to, for example, source code from TADS, which I've looked at and stuff, it seemed a lot friendlier. I'm sure there are programmers who would disagree. There are, but for myself, I have a knack for programming, but maybe not a legitimate talent for programming. And so it appealed to me. At the time in 97, it was very DIY. There was a compiler that you had to download. There was a library of system files with the basic vocabulary and structure for creating rooms and properties and routines and so forth. And you had to put that all together in a text editor of some sort and then compile it and then run it through an interpreter to test it and so forth. 10 years ago, Graham Nelson released Inform 7, which is a complete development environment for Inform. And the language itself has been vastly overhauled. It actually looks even more like natural English. It looks like natural English. It's not really natural English underneath the hood, but it looks and reads even more comfortably to someone like me. And it has the convenience of having the compiler and the text editor and the library files and the interpreter all bundled into a single application so that everything is much, much simpler. You program it, you click a button, compile it, and then start playing it to test it all in one sitting. It's pretty nice.
The process of making games in our experience is often defined by this interplay of the imagination of the creator and the limitations of the technology. That will then shape the game essentially. So how was that in your case when you started working with Inform? Did everything work out perfectly as you imagined it, or were there limitations?
There were certainly limitations. For one thing, Inform at the time had a hard limit of how large a file you could create. I think it was 512K was the outermost limit. And I actually hit that limit early on when I was maybe 3/4 the way through and was actually convinced that I wasn't going to be able to finish the game for quite some time. I took my woes to the interactive fiction discussion group at the time and got some tips on how to make my code more compact and managed to squeeze it all in. But I do think that there were maybe puzzles and elements of the game at the time that I probably wasn't really satisfied with, but I felt like I was running up against a limit of what I could do. And it sort of felt like, especially by the end, and everything else had been built. And so revising things was pretty monumental, and I had very little room to do so. And so there were always a number of elements that I sort of wished that I could have fleshed out more in the original.
How did this work? Did you start programming with an idea in your head, or did you lay out everything in advance, like elaborately make puzzle structure charts and room charts and everything?
Oh, no. There was very little in the way of planning or organization. It started very organically. I had a vague idea of the plot. I sort of borrowed elements from a few of Lovecraft's stories and mashed them together and had this idea of a town and a cult and an imminent ritual and so forth. And I think I had a rough idea of the map. I started out with a map of the town of Arkham that was published by Chaosium, the role-playing game, the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, which I was also a fan of at the time. And I started out with an idea of basing the town on that map and then realizing that more than 3 or 4 streets was going to be a pretty monumental task. So it got pruned down a great deal from there. And it just grew. I would come up with ideas for scenes that I wanted to put in there as I sort of built the story from beginning to end. And I would build in the rooms and the objects that I would need for that scene and then go back and clean up the stuff that I had already created to make it fit. And then there were lots of dead ends that I had to abandon and discard and rebuild in a different way. There was originally going to be a cat that you brought with you from Texas, and part of the luggage was going to be the cat carrier, and the cat would escape and then pop up here and there from time to time in the game, and that got killed. The idea got killed early on.
Not the cat.
I had another idea where you were transported into a different dimension, and there were going to be this whole series of surreal pattern matching puzzles with floating shapes and glyphs and so forth, and that got killed also early on.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah, that was not one of my best ideas, but it really did just sort of grow organically as it went. There was very little in the way of planning, and it shows, I think, in the original. There are a lot of features that just sort of hang out on the periphery without a whole lot of purpose to them, except for the atmosphere and so forth.
I don't think it's particularly noticeable, actually, which speaks to your talent as a storyteller. And also, I think you made a very good decision, at least from our point of view, when you created a game that was relatively open, a game map and game world, which was relatively open, and introduced that structure of days, which kind of work like acts, so that you revisit locations again and again, and you have that feeling of exploring that game world. Is that something that you had in mind from the beginning, to have that open world and the day structure, or did that come during development?
It's interesting. I often feel like I kind of stumbled into a lot of the good design decisions that are in there. I mean, it was my first game that I had ever tried to create in any serious way, and I'd never really given much thought to puzzle structure or map structure or act structure or any kind of structure. I do remember there was a game that was very popular at the time called, I believe it was Christminster, and I'm blanking on who wrote it, but it's a well-regarded classic, and there's a time structure that's similar to the day structure in Anchorhead. I was inspired by that. I thought that would make a good way to organize the story. And I remember being somewhat inspired by the map structure of Trinity, which was always my favorite Infocom game. Once you get to the land of the mushrooms, it is a largely open map with gates around the edges that lead to smaller territories that you then explore and get more and more keys to the rest of the gates. So I do remember being somewhat inspired by that structure when I created the town, which is initially quite open. And I thought it would be neat to be able to essentially explore the whole town, or at least the outsides of it, from the very beginning. And sometimes reviewers have complained about the number of locked doors, but I always felt like that was the neat part of the game, was that you were presented with this town with dozens of locked doors and places you can't go and mysteries that you want to solve. Those are areas that you want to find out about. And so the game pretty much lets you go about opening those doors however you want, although it does sort of nudge you into, a certain sequence. And then that sequence builds the story scene by scene.
You mentioned the IF community once or twice and seeking help with Inform. Were you part of the IF community at that time, or did you just, read in forums?
I participated in the discussion groups quite a bit. I was still pretty young, and I had recently discovered the internet and discussion boards. And so some of my contributions to the conversation probably make me cringe a little bit now. I thought I had a lot of things to say, and being well regarded for my game really only kind of fed my ego at first. But yes, I did enjoy talking and discussing ideas and so on and so forth. In the years since, in recent years, I don't usually participate as much, at least not in discussions. Every once in a while, I will go back and get my toes wet in the there's a intfiction.org web forum that I frequent pretty often. Usually I just lurk, but if people have questions, technical questions, I like trying to help people out with their questions about Inform 7 and how to implement this or that.
We felt that Anchorhead in many ways plays like a very old school interactive fiction game. It could have been an Infocom game in the best sense, because it has this rich game world. It's a storytelling game, but it also has puzzles. Lots of them. There's a large inventory. There's pretty tricky puzzles. And actually, I saw that the Interactive Fiction database has given Anchorhead a difficulty rating of cruel.
Yeah.
And I would second that. So that is a pretty fitting description. But I was wondering, when you were shaping Anchorhead, what did you have in mind how the players were supposed to feel?
Right. Well, it is an old school game. It was created during the old school, and those design decisions were pretty popular at the time. I did really want it to make it very much like an Infocom game. As far as the cruelty goes, I did want the player to constantly feel endangered. I also enjoyed writing creative and vivid death scenes. I thought that was just fun. And I wanted death to be very possible throughout the game, and I wanted every death scene to be sort of uniquely grotesque so that even hitting a dead end would be fun. And the cruelty scale, Andrew Plotkin actually developed the scale, and I've read his description of what the various ratings are meant to mean. And it's not just how possible it is to die or reach an end point of the game, but it's also how easy it is to trap yourself in a non-winnable situation, whether you will immediately know that you have trapped yourself in a non-winnable situation. And in Anchorhead, Andrew had not invented his cruelty scale at that point. And those were less crucial design concerns, I guess, amongst the community. The idea of a puzzle being fair mostly meant, was it easy to guess what the designer wanted you to do? How much did you have to read his mind or her mind when playing the game, and how much sense it made? The idea of trapping yourself in a non-winnable situation was something that you maybe wanted to avoid, but I don't think there were a lot of conversations about it at the time in 97. So all of those possibilities in Anchorhead, I would say mostly came about from me simply not thinking about it very much. And the areas where you could get trapped and stuck but not die were regrettable, and I tried to avoid them where I could, but where I couldn't, I think I just shrugged and said, well, it's a dangerous world. And I believe in the original, in the introduction, I did put a warning not to throw your house keys into the ocean because the game would let you do it, and then you'd be stuck.
Okay, I do have a bone to pick with you later on about one particular puzzle, but we'll get to that. First of all, I need to mention that I'm really happy that you brought up the character deaths, the death scenes, because I do have a point in my notes specifically about the prose of the death scenes, because I think the game in general is wonderfully written, but the prose is particularly evocative and rich whenever the protagonist dies. And it did seem to us that you took extra care in writing these. But now knowing that it's actually your wife that you killed off time and again in these scenes, it's a bit morbid.
I suppose it is a little bit morbid. No one in my family has taken offense at it.
That's good. You're still together.
Yes. And we both have somewhat morbid senses of humor and are able to appreciate that sort of thing. But yes, I did. I wanted the deaths to be almost collector's items. I wanted people to be interested in figuring out how many deaths they could discover because they would be unique and fun to play with. This is one of the things I enjoy about interactive fiction in general, is the idea of packing as much description and evocativeness into as compact and efficient piece of prose as possible. You know, I've only got 3 sentences, maybe at max, at most, maybe 2-3 sentences to sell a really fun and interesting death scene or a room description and so forth. And how can I fold as much as I can into that prose with those limits?
We especially enjoyed reading the Black Book.
Oh, yes.
Get mad in the end and pull your eyes out. That was a nice touch.
Thank you.
It did feel like a reward indeed. I mean, it's a dead end in the game, then you're dead at that point, but reading the descriptions is rewarding. But since we're already at the point where you mentioned and described that you took extra care of putting these little things in the descriptions in the game, there's one thing in particular also which I'd like to mention, because we loved this attention to detail. And I'm not entirely sure whether that's in the original game as well, because that's something that we noticed in the remake, but it's the subtle changes in descriptions which happen based on whether your character already knows something or doesn't. For instance, if you are in the mansion and you're looking at the paintings of the Verlac family, and if your character already knows that the original Verlag is called Cruceus, then that would be in the description of one of the paintings. Or going back to the bedroom and looking in the mirror and finding a description of yourself that reflects what you've been through. I mean, that's something that we more or less discovered by accident, but I was so happy reading that because that's something that most of the players probably will never notice, but you took the care to put that in the game, and I really appreciate that.
That's a good illustration of the advantages of Inform 7 when I redid the game. Those little touches were a lot more possible in Inform 7 and the developments of the language, since there are very compact and efficient ways to create conditional text like that. You could have done it in Inform 6 in 1997, but it would have been much more complex and difficult to track and probably would have run up against the memory limit a lot quicker.
We touched upon the deaths, which are delightfully dark, but there's another thing in the game that's less delightfully dark, and that's the notion of incest and child abuse, which creates, I would say, like gruesome moments when reading it, even if it's not pictured. Why did you put that in?
At the time when I wrote it originally, it struck me as, it was a dark and taboo subject, but you didn't have the same amount of, I guess, cultural sensitivity around those topics as you do today, which is not to say that cultural sensitivity is bad in any way. It's just those kinds of conversations about sexual abuse had not really started in the 90s, at least in America. And at the time when I kind of conceived of the idea, I think I borrowed the idea of the Verlag family and him passing his consciousness down from a couple of Lovecraft stories. I believe The Thing on the Doorstep and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward sort of inspired that idea. I took some elements from those stories and then sort of mashed them together into this concept. And then the mechanics of his ritual to impregnate a woman and then give birth to a daughter and then impregnate the daughter and then pass himself on to the grandson just sort of suggested themselves. And at the time, it was dark and diabolical and gross, but it wasn't as sensitive a topic as it is today. Nowadays, I would probably think twice before I embarked on a story like that if I were going to publish it. At least think carefully about it. And in the new game, there actually is a trigger warning in the game. If you open up the about text, the help text, one of the options is to read a short trigger warning that explains that these topics are in the game and warns people if those are sensitive topics for them. And I feel like that's definitely warranted at this stage.
A lot of the motives and topics which you have in Anchorhead are clearly inspired by Lovecraft and Lovecraft's fiction, but I'm not entirely sure, but I think child abuse is not a topic which comes up in Lovecraft at all. So we felt like that is something that you brought into the game.
Yeah, Lovecraft doesn't really know anything about children as far as you can tell by reading his stories. He doesn't really do children at all. So those were things that I thought were interesting. Clearly there's a lot of fertile ground for horror around children and child endangerment and stuff like that. And horror is about the things that we fear and are anxious about. And there's plenty of that around children. So it easily suggests itself. But yeah, Lovecraft himself, he didn't really do women and he didn't really do children. And so those were, I thought, interesting ways to sort of make the story mine in a way that set it apart from just being a Lovecraft pastiche.
You already mentioned in terms of inspiration that it's Lovecraft and it's interactive fiction. But one of the clearly strong things about Anchorhead is your prose, your style of writing. So where does that come from?
It's always something that I've been fairly talented at. I was singled out. I had a high school teacher who noticed it and got me to submit my writing to a contest, and it won, and that was pretty revelatory to me. And I probably don't practice it as much. I did have aspirations at one point about making a career of writing. It didn't really work out for a number of reasons, but I do enjoy writing when I have an interesting project and a good reason to put it together. It's just something I've always been talented at and had taken some pride in. I enjoy crafting sentences. I enjoy crafting prose. And as I said earlier, I find the challenge of crafting prose in as tight a word limit as most of interactive fiction enforces to be very interesting.
I was especially impressed by the changes you made from the 2018 game to the 1998 game. So I felt the prose was already strong in 1998, but somewhat rough. And all the changes you made, I took the pains of reading them through sentence for sentence in some parts. And it was like the work of a very experienced editor. So somebody who clearly knows his way around all the light touches, making sentences shorter and more efficient. So did this come from the writing you did in the meantime? Or was it just like, more experienced reading?
Both. I'm a very harsh critic of myself. I have a tendency to write something that I'm very happy with and then a week later look at it and really hate it. In this case, it was 20 years worth of waiting before I went back and reread it. And, as I said, I haven't made a career of it, but I do read continuously and I do write for little personal projects and side projects. And so I have gotten better at it, I hope. And there were a number of tics and stylistic foibles that I had back then that I wouldn't do now, and things I've learned or styles that I've developed that I like better now. And I could see also where the prose might have been sloppy. When you're writing a game solo, it's just you reading it. It's just you writing it. It's just you editing it. And on top of the prose, there's all the programming that you have to concentrate on as well. And the tools for just sitting down and revising it. It's not as straightforward as just revising a normal piece of prose. So, the interesting thing about the original Anchorhead is that to a very large degree, it is a first draft. The original that's published now is very much a first draft. It's not like I went through and tried to tighten up room descriptions in 1997. I would put it together, I would read it, I would tweak it, and then it was done, and I would move on to the next thing.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that it's not like there's one 1998 version and then there's this one 2018 version. There are iterations in between, if I'm not mistaken. I think even the original version went through a couple of versions, didn't it?
It did. I think there were 5 releases total. And the releases were mainly in response to major bugs that I hadn't found. And I would also, if I recall, take advantage of a new release to maybe revise a puzzle or change something that I didn't feel worked very well. I didn't have a lot of self-discipline in that regard. So sometimes the different versions might change in substantial ways how a particular puzzle might be solved or how some element might appear in the game. For the newest version, for the 2018, I've been trying to be much more disciplined. For one thing, it's for sale on Steam. I don't want to keep working on it after it's been produced and released in that sort of context. But also I did spend a lot more time trying to make sure that this was going to be a definitive version that I could continue to be happy with.
But if I'm not mistaken, that was not the first time that you returned to Anchorhead, wasn't it? I think you started revising it earlier.
Yes, I did. When Inform 7 was first released about 10 years earlier, I had the idea of rewriting Anchorhead in it, partially because I thought it would be a nice project to update Anchorhead in ways that I'd wanted. And also, it seemed to me to be a good way to learn Inform 7 more thoroughly. I'm usually better at learning a new computer language or a new computer system when I have a specific project to work on. So I thought that would be a nice combination of goals. It didn't end up working out mainly because I had 2 toddlers at the time. And they just devoured so much more time.
I can relate.
Yeah, I had no way of anticipating that. I have twins and...
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it just devours. When they're young, it just devours everything else.
And what was different for 2018 then?
Well, my kids were in high school, so I was able to devote a lot more attention and time to other things finally. And I think I just had more momentum. The impetus for creating the new game was actually, I stumbled across, quite by accident, somebody was creating a Let's Play thread on Something Awful, the website, and they were doing a Let's Play of Anchorhead, and somebody linked to the thread and was talking about Anchorhead, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll go take a look and see what they think about it. And I saw that the writer of the Let's Play thread was also an artist and was supplementing the thread with illustrations as he went along. They were much more kind of cartoony line drawings, but I did really like them. I was kind of delighted by the idea of the illustrations. By that time, Inform 7 had developed a lot more and was even easier to use. and I had a lot more experience with it. I'd done a few other projects in it as well. And I thought of the idea of updating Anchorhead not only to take advantage of Inform 7, but also to present it as this illustrated version where you would have not like a graphic text adventure where each room is a picture and you have to hunt pixels and point at objects, but more like a book with illustrated plates illustrating various scenes, and you would unlock those illustrations as you went along. And at first, I contacted the author of the thread and said, I want to do this and I would love to use your art and I'd like to pay you to make more art and sort of fill out the whole game with it. And that didn't end up working mainly because of scheduling. He didn't have the time to devote to that, which was fine. But by that time, I was really enamored with the idea. So I put out a call for illustrators in a number of different forums, some freelance artist forums, and also on the Int Fiction forum, and got an enormous number of respondents because I think there are a lot of hungry illustrators out there.
Yes.
And found one whose art I really, really liked and worked out a system. And that's really how it came about. Once I saw the art and had the idea of bringing specific scenes in the game to life with illustrations as well as the prose, that got me much more excited about the idea. And I think that gave me the momentum I needed to push it all the way to completion this time.
The 2018 version is not simply a retouched version of the original Anchorhead with additional illustrations and prose. It's basically a fundamental remake because you changed the entire layout of the game map, you changed puzzles. So we were wondering, what was your philosophy, your guiding principle for the remake?
The main philosophy was there were parts that I was never really particularly satisfied with. And I wanted to use the opportunity. There are no memory limits in Inform 7, so I could make it pretty much as big as I wanted to. And I wanted to get things in a way that felt more right to me and that worked more with the story. And I did have kind of a laundry list of puzzles and scenes that I wanted to make better, that I wanted to make definitive, things that seemed like a neat idea when I first created them, but I didn't feel like they really stood the test of time. And I wanted this opportunity to make it a much more definitive game. So, for example, the wine cellar puzzle, at the time I came up with it and I wasn't really very satisfied with it, but I wanted to finish it and move on and get onto something else. And this time I really sat down and thought about what was something that maybe made a little bit more sense or fit with the sort of general atmosphere and world building with the game. And there were other elements that I had since come up with that I thought would have been a lot cooler if I had more room to play with it, if I hadn't had the memory limit to deal with in 97. So, for example, the asylum got expanded into almost a little mini puzzle on its own, whereas in the first game it was just 3 rooms in a row with the madman following you. Now it's almost kind of a sort of a Hunt the Wumpus style mini game where you have to work your way around the madman and figure out how to get through the gate before he catches up with you. I mean, that was really the main philosophical drive. What were the things that I didn't like about the original? And if I could go back and redo them, how would I do them different? And this was my chance to do it different.
Well, that's really interesting because if you went through the game like that and scrutinized every element, deciding whether to keep it or change it, then you must have made the conscious decision to keep all of the dead ends in the game. Like, for instance, in the paper mill, if you don't take the fuse with you downstairs to the workshop, then you can't get back up and things like that. So why, Michael, why?
I did. I actually started out with the idea of creating an optional system. Well, I knew that changing the cruelty level of the game and actually erasing all the dead ends would be way more complex than I wanted to get into, and also would involve a lot of curtailing player agency in a way that I didn't really want to do. I mean, the only way to stop the player from locking themselves out of victory by prevent them from throwing the house keys in the ocean and simply putting an arbitrary refusal to do that action. And I didn't want to do that. So I decided to leave it all in. The fuse is probably the weakest part, the part where I had the most trouble trying to come up with a good way to work that puzzle out. I would say the fuse is where I kind of fell into the same trap that I did in 1997, where I kind of wrote myself into a corner and then decided to leave it. There's a bug fix that I have yet to publish, but it does have a slightly stronger hint about the fuse, and it has a few more indications that the fuse is something that has to do with the elevator and perhaps makes it more likely that the player will have it on them when they go down into the factory. But it does still definitely count as a cruel trap that is perhaps left over from the old mindset of the game.
So before Gunnar can get another word, and I need to mention one more thing, and let me preface that by saying that we really liked Anchorhead a lot. It was a very rewarding experience, wonderfully written game. And I think that most of the changes which you did to the 2018 versions were thoughtful additions, which made the game even more rich. But there's this one exception, and that's the safe combination puzzle, because in the original game, you found that combination in a journal in the dining room, and then you just had to enter the numbers. And in the new version, you changed that to more of a hint on the notebook of Michael. And that really got us stumped, that puzzle. That was something which we were stuck for so long for this particular puzzle. And I think it's one of the most confusing puzzles which I have encountered in my career as a gamer, because that hint on the notebook, that gives a lot of information which points to something else. Like that note that Michael writes specifically mentions that he's going to go down to the cellar and that he's dreamt of stars and constellations, and everything points to the cellar or what's below the wine cellar. And I would never have made that connection to that safe. And also what is particularly confusing is that this hint mentions that Michael dreamt of monsters and then hands and eyes. But how are we supposed to know how many fingers a monster's hand has? Probably not 5. So, and then we had that one hint, because if you look at the painting of, I think it's Elijah Warlock, it says that he has 6 fingers on his hand. And so we thought, okay, that must be connected to that safe combination. Can you understand our confusion?
Certainly. I had never made that connection between the 6-fingered hand and the hands and eyes and fingers. I thought that the safe combination in the original was maybe just a little bit too straightforward. You know, at some point somebody had written down the combo to the safe, which is, you know, just bad security to begin with. And then you just happen to find it, and there are the numbers, and you type it in. And I wanted that puzzle to be a little bit more, I guess, interactive, something that I wanted people to puzzle over a little bit more rather than simply, oh, here are the numbers and there it goes. And so I came up with this idea of the eyes and fingers and so forth. I believe the original game, amongst the various releases, I actually changed where that combination is found between release 1 and 5. I want to say that at one point it was scribbled on the bookmark that falls out of the library book when you get it from the library, and then later I put it in a journal tucked into a drawer somewhere, once again because I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting than just having the numbers fall into your lap. And then in 2017, I came up with the idea of creating this code out of fingers and eyes. And I've heard other people complain about it. So I think it's fair. I think those are fair criticisms.
We published our thoughts about the game as a series of podcasts. So we played a little bit and then talked about it. And we published it a while after we actually had played it. And quite the number of people commented below the recording. How can they not get it? I want to shout into the podcast. How dumb is Christian? So we might be outliers. But I don't know. It was kind of confusing.
Yeah, I've heard other people complaining about it as well. And I think at the time I thought that the structure of that sentence is such that it's kind of divided into 3 groups of eyes and or fingers. And I thought that that might trigger, you know, we're talking about 3 elements, 3 numbers, and then that would point people to the safe because they've probably found the safe by that point. But there are always connections that people make. And I think certainly pointing it to the cellar is interesting. The 6 fingers on the painting is a red herring that I just never even considered. And so once your brain hairs off down one of those paths and then, you know, your focus narrows, it can be just really hard to back up and restart and think about it in a different way. So that's always the danger with these sorts of puzzle games, is how much do you hint about it? How much hinting is too simple and how little hinting is too hard and so forth.
Yeah, it is a challenge, in particular with a game which is as complex as Anchorhead is. And also there's so many inventory items that I think it's probably very hard for you to keep track of every instance where something could be useful from a certain perspective. And there's just so many permutations of that. And one thing which, for instance, we only noticed after we had finished the game is that we never had to use the cellar key, which is on the keyring from the beginning, because the cellar door is always unlocked in the 2018 version. So I guess that was just a relic from the original version where you actually had to use that key.
I think if you go directly to the cellar at the beginning, I could be wrong, but I believe that if you go directly to the cellar in the beginning, the door will be locked. But by that point, you have the key, and the key is on the key ring. And there's a system in the game, which I originally put into the 97 game because I knew there were a lot of keys and a lot of locks. And I didn't want people to have to fiddle with them a lot. So if you have the key on your person and the key is on the key ring, then if you try to open a locked door, the game will automatically assume that you try every key until you find the right one.
Which is a very nice touch.
Yeah, and in the Inform 7 version, there are even more sort of automated processes where if you attempt to move in the direction of a door, you'll automatically try to open it. If the door is locked, you will automatically try to unlock it. And if you have the keys, then it'll automatically search through all the keys. So if you simply go through a door and you have the key on you, it'll all kind of happen in a sort of blur of those parentheticals that you get, going north, first opening the door, first unlocking the door, first trying all your keys, and then the door's open. And so to a certain extent, that kind of erases the need to really worry about locked doors much at all and can kind of give the illusion that it wasn't unlocked. But I believe the cellar door does start out locked at the very beginning of the game. It's just so easy to pass through it because by that time you'll have already found the key. It's not really meant to be a puzzle.
Then I probably just missed it.
Probably.
One of the pitfalls I would find because I didn't have any sort of plan or structure is that I would build in a puzzle and then realize that that puzzle had just made another part of the game impossible or had made another large section of the game pointless. I had just created a puzzle that allowed you to bypass a huge amount of the game. And that was probably my biggest nemesis when trying to redesign the game. In the original 97, there's a whole scene where you meet the wino in the vacant lot. There's a big conversation with him, and it's kind of a major information found where you find out a lot of the history of the town. And it's right at the end of a scene, and to be kind of climactic and dramatic, and it ends with you handing over this talisman of protection that you have worked to get. And the player at this point feels like they probably have need of it, but you have to sacrifice that in order to get this copper key, the copper key that lets you into the sewers. But in fact, it is possible to complete the entire game without ever using that key, without ever unlocking the sewer door.
It is?
It is. It is. It's not even that hard. You can finish the original, and it doesn't even feel like you had to go out of your way to avoid it. The original.
The original. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So one of my goals in the new game was to fix that, to make that copper key necessary, and to make the passage under the sewers something that was sort of vital to completing the game. There's parts of the end game where parts of the town are blocked off, and your only way between the north and south halves of the map is through that tunnel. And at some point, you have to use that key to unlock the sewer grating. That turned out to be a nightmare. I went through so many redesigns because it was a combination of map structure and puzzle structure and way puzzles gated different parts of the map, and this made this part accessible and this made this part inaccessible, and it was so complex. It took me probably half a dozen very different solutions involving tearing up the map and creating new connections and then erasing new connections and so forth. And I only fixed it at the 11th hour. Is one of the last things I fixed.
And the sewer is still glitchy, at least in the version that we played, because if you enter the pipe from the beach, then you can't get out again in the beginning of the game.
Yes, that's the big bug that I've let go until I'm hoping that this coming year I'm going to try and update the game to fix that bug and add a few bits of polish and so forth. It won't be a major revision, but fixing that sewer pipe will be one of them.
Confused the hell out of us. So, why is this possible? What am I overlooking here?
Exactly.
So we noticed that you removed or obfuscated Lovecraftian terms in the 2018 version, or perhaps even in the earlier version you started that. So I was always looking forward to, like seeing elder gods mentioned. Once I heard that this is a Lovecraft game, and you didn't do that. So was this for legal reasons?
No, not really. I don't think there are any copyright restrictions on those names, Arkham and Nyarlathotep and so forth. I started out in the first game. I think it was another way that I wanted to make the story mine in a way that set it apart from just a Lovecraft pastiche, but still acknowledge that I wasn't creating all this, that this was all inspired by Lovecraft stories. Part of the appeal and fascination of the Lovecraft mythos is the way that all the different authors in his circle at the time, Howard and Ashton Smith and so forth, would share these elements and would create a sort of shared universe where you felt that the investigators investigating Cthulhu over in this story could at any point travel up to Massachusetts and talk to the people at Arkham and go see the monster at Dunwich and so forth. And I didn't want to suggest that my story was necessarily part of that shared universe. Because I was borrowing all these liberal elements, I felt like this wasn't a world in which the Dunwich horror had happened. This was just a different world where the mythos played out in this way. So in the original, I altered some of the names or changed some of the terminology a little bit, but I didn't go all the way with it. Like I still mentioned Arkham in the original 1997. I had the town being available somewhere else, and the name for the college and the river was Miskatonic instead of Miskatonic. And for the new version, I wanted to go back and make that more of a complete and thorough job. So Arkham got changed to Innswick, which is a combination of Innsmouth and Dunwich. And I felt that just dropping the IC from Miskatonic was a little bit weak. So I wanted to come up with a name that was similar, but also in the mythology of Anchorhead, there are tribes of Native Americans. So I wanted to have something that kind of sounded like it might be a mash together of a European name and Native American terminology, which you see a lot in America and the way towns and rivers and so forth are named. So Miskahawny comes from that.
One other thing which the original version still had was a scoring system, like most of the old Infocom text adventures had. So you did something right in the game, you got a point, and that's something that you removed for the 2018 version. Why is that?
I felt like it was extraneous at the time in 97. Scoring points came from the original Infocom games, of course, and it was fun. It was kind of like you're collecting points and so forth. And there was a term back then, the last lousy point. So it was kind of a fashionable in-joke to have, 1 point that was tied to some seemingly innocuous or irrelevant action. And so it was kind of an Easter egg that you would find. And if you didn't find it, you could win the game, but you would only have 99 out of 100 points. And I took that out. I felt like it was a little bit too gamey. I kind of wanted to focus more on just the story itself. I didn't think that the game really lost anything by losing the scoring system. The last lousy point was if you take a bath on the first night after you get back to the house, you get an extra point. And that's also inspired by my wife. She loves baths. She creates in the bath for hours on end. And that was kind of a tribute to her.
Okay, so I would have gotten that point and Gunnar wouldn't.
Who knows?
Well, you didn't take the bath and I did. Anyway, so Anchorhead, we already mentioned it. It's a widely celebrated game. It's considered one of the greatest interactive fiction games of all time. It's won awards. It's been lauded and applauded. We wonder, what impact did Anchorhead have on your life?
As I said, I've been surprised as anyone. And obviously, it's very pleasant to have to have the game lauded. I'm very proud of it. At the time, at 97, after I published it, I had ideas that I would continue to sort of roll across the interactive fiction landscape and produce some great games. But of course, it doesn't really work like that. I've put out a few other projects since. I find writing enjoyable but difficult, very time-consuming and energy-consuming. I don't devote a lot of time to it, as much as I would need to make a career out of it. And in the meantime, I kind of fell out of the interactive fiction community for a while, for several years. When I came back to it in 2017, it was very, very different. The online environment had changed, and a lot of really fantastic and innovative work has been done by other people. Emily Short's interactive fiction. I feel like anything I write would just measure up so paltry compared to most of what she's written. And then there's been a great deal of exploration into more linear, choose your own adventure style interactive fiction, which I find very interesting. I don't think it interests me as much as the idea of parser-based fiction, but the complaints and limitations of parser-based fiction are also very apparent. I don't have any illusions about that. Tying yourself to a natural English or natural language parser is going to limit what you can do and what you can portray effectively in a game. And so, coming up with a really good idea that has the level of interest and momentum that I need to really throw myself into it doesn't come along all that often. I hope maybe something will strike again, but we'll see.
Anchorhead has received one of the rarest and most flattering accolades that a game can receive, and that is a tribute game, an entire game dedicated as a tribute to Anchorhead, which is called, and now I have to pronounce it, Crane Manor, I guess?
Yes.
So when did you learn of that project?
Andrew Plotkin had mentioned it to me. I corresponded with him a lot in getting the game into a format that I could distribute on Steam. I got a lot of technical help from Andrew, but I also hadn't been back to the interactive fiction forum for quite some time. I'd been, worrying about other things, and he just happened to mention it in passing and said, has anybody contacted you about it? Because it would be fantastic if you contributed a room to it. And I was, no, I hadn't. In all fairness, a general call for writers had been put out on the interactive fiction forum, and I just hadn't been there. So I hadn't seen it. So I went and responded to the call. Honestly, it was such a unique and flattering and kind of intimidating project to have so many writers and creators who have been affected by this game, whether they wanted to pay tribute to it or critique it or satirize it or just comment on it was just kind of mind-blowing. And so many of them being luminaries of the IF community. Andrew Plotkin's work has always been in awe of his work and his writing. Emily Short, I already mentioned. Graham Nelson contributed a little bit to it. And just all of these people together. And I kind of felt like, wow, I'm the author. I feel like people are maybe expecting something pretty impressive, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to deliver it. And I kind of parlayed that insecurity, I think, into the room that I contributed and the themes that it puts out. But yeah, that was a fantastic and very fun project to contribute to. And I found that Crane Manor had a very specific and rigid philosophy of having a kind rating on the difficulty scale. There were not going to be any dead ends. There were not going to be any traps. Part of the author guidelines that they distributed to everyone for that was, make sure that your room does not put anyone in an unwinnable state, that does not destroy any inventory items arbitrarily or anything like that. And I managed to accidentally write a dead end into my room in the very first draft. I had to go back.
Old habits.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, very cool. I was so surprised and excited to see that a game like Crane Mania exists. And as I mentioned, I think it's the ultimate flattery, and also it's deserved. It is deserved because I think Anchorhead really is a wonderful achievement.
Thank you.
But the most important question is, what does your wife think of the game?
She thinks it's fantastic. She has played it. She has played it through to the end. Both versions, actually. She played it in 97, and she's played the new version as well.
You made sure very carefully that she doesn't die.
No, actually, I showed off some of the death sequences.
Okay.
Yeah, she's not a text adventure gamer, but I had to make her promise to allow me to help her pass puzzles, because left to her own devices, she wouldn't ask for help. She would just puzzle about it and not solve it for months or years and never get through it. So I had to make her promise that when she got stuck, she would ask me for a hint and I would guide her through the tough parts so that she would finish it, because I wanted her to finish and read the whole thing. She really has enjoyed it.
And have your twins played the game yet?
They have not. They have never really gotten into the text adventure games. I tried to get them into it early on when they were very young. I actually wrote a children's game.
Oh, very nice.
It's The Lost Islands of Alabaz. It has a strictly kind difficulty rating. You can't trap yourself or lock yourself out of victory in it. It does have some, I think, fair critiques have been made against it. But by the time I finished it, they had grown up past the point where they were particularly entranced by it. And although they've both dabbled in it a little bit, neither one of them has finished it.
Oh, that's too bad.
Man, kids these days.
Well, it's a very different environment. I think the interesting thing about text-based fiction is that it merged in an environment when virtually all of your interface with a computer was going to be text-based. And that, writing Get Lamp on a interactive fiction game is really very similar in many ways to typing in, movedir or copy directory, on a DOS-based operating system, and how people, particularly technical people, actually interacted with computers at the time. So it just fit. And I think as much as I love it, I think it's always going to be a very niche interest, not only because of the puzzling that it requires, but that it really requires people to interface with a computer in a way that they just don't anymore. That just doesn't happen. It's very different from how you do virtually anything online.
I never thought that interactive fiction would be something that's particularly accessible to or interesting for children. I think you have to be of a certain age and maturity also to really appreciate a work like Anchorhead. And I think your children will reach that point, and that's something to look forward to. They will appreciate Anchorhead at some point and be very proud of their dad.
I think they will. They're both avid gamers, and they're both actually they know about Anchorhead, and they think it's very cool that it has gotten so many awards and is sort of semi-famous. Their dad is semi-famous in a very small and specific context. And they both find that really cool and interesting. And my son in particular will mention to me if he sees Anchorhead mentioned somewhere or anything like that, and has expressed that, one of these days he's going to sit down and read the whole thing. And, it's interesting. It requires a different mindset. It requires a lot of patience. You're reading a, novella-length story while sitting in front of a screen. You can't move away from the screen unless you've got, nowadays you can put it on mobile devices, which is nice. But, sitting in front of a monitor, and every paragraph you have to work for. My sister has published a couple of novels, and she has expressed guilt about not playing Anchorhead. And I told her, look, if your novel was set up in such a way that, every time I turned a page, I had to solve a crossword puzzle, I probably wouldn't have finished it either. So, so no guilt.
Thank you very much. Christian, do you have more questions?
No, actually, all of my questions have been answered, even more than that. Michael, I'm so happy that you took the time to talk to us. That was fascinating. And again, to reiterate, we really enjoyed Anchorhead, in particular reading the prose and being immersed in the game world that you created. That was a fantastic journey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.